Welcome, everyone, to another edition of the Henry III Roundtable. We're discussing the events of the longest reign in medieval English history, that of Henry III, of course, and I am joined by historians John Marshall, Michael Ray, and Hugh Ridgway. And lately, we've been concentrating on the latter part of Henry's reign, namely the tumultuous period following the beginning of the reforms in 1258. Last time, we were talking about the Treaty of Paris, which established peace between England and France after 100 years of war and the seizure of Normandy and so forth, and how it was considered both a triumph and a sellout on both ends, both in England and France. But it did establish peace between these two realms for at least a generation, something that was unheard of for the rest of the Middle Ages. And but following these events in France, things started to go very sour in England. Simon de Montfort, who had tried to block the Treaty of Paris as a way of getting his claims against Henry and the crown settled, that had failed, and he returned to England in a very unsettled mood, shall we say. And Henry remains behind in France, and he's delayed there. So just to go over the very basics, the heir to the French throne, young Louis, dies suddenly, and Henry, now that he and Louis more or less consider themselves a big extended family, Henry stays and joins the funeral cortege of the young prince, which makes a great impression, of course, on the French royal family. And then there is the marriage of his daughter Beatrice to John of Brittany that had to be delayed because of the funeral. And by the time they more or less wrapped that up, plus I think there were some outstanding issues with the treaty. So Henry is not going to make it back by Candlemas, so the 2nd of February. And the provisions of Oxford, the constitution enacted by the reforms of 1258, say that Parliament shall meet 3 times a year, beginning on Candlemas, and Henry can't make it back for that. So he tells his regent back home, or the Regency Council, led by his justiciar Hugh Bigot, that he's going to be delayed, and they shall not hold Parliament till he returns. And Simon de Montfort sees an opportunity. So anybody want to take it from there? Because Simon is back in England, and he, of course, sees. I don't know. Do you think he sees what's going on as Henry and his counselors in France, that they're trying to abrogate the provisions of Oxford here, like they're trying to subvert them in a way that Henry can slowly start taking back all power? I mean, does it begin here?
It's a good question. I'd always taken the view that it was while the cat's away, the mice will play, that he took advantage of the absence. But Hugh, what's your view of that?
Well, I think Montfort, did claim something along those lines, didn't he, during his, the depositions of his so-called trial in the summer of 1260. But I think the main thing that Montfort was presumably trying to do was to get a better settlement out of the baronial council, because he wasn't happy with the offer that, well, the deal that they'd given him in 1259, the previous year. And I mean, it was quite substantial. It was £400, wasn't it? But then there were further claims, weren't there, that he claimed that hadn't been satisfied. So I'm assuming that this was really what one of the things that he was really keen on achieving, and presumably by means of somehow influencing the Parliament, in a Candlemas Parliament.
So Hugh, do you think that Simon wants Parliament to convene so that he can put his case directly to them without Henry and the other counselors there, and then maybe they can reach a settlement that way?
Yes, that's what I think it could be the case. Yes, yes. But it, just as Edward, of course, was in league with Montfort by that stage, wanted to put his case before Parliament. Um, I take it about, for example, the control of his estates, which he had tried to start to exercise control, and was he didn't like the way in which the provisions threatened, and the sort of people who were in the council, such as the Earl of Gloucester, would be sort of threatening Edward's control over his estates, um, and um, and of course he'd been taking various steps against the sort of people that the interests of Peter of Savoy and the Savoyards. In He'd been sort of ejecting various officials from controls of his estates who had been appointed by the sort of Queen and her faction earlier on, and I think that that's really sort of what Edward was interested in. I think they both of them also felt a certain degree of frustration about the Treaty of Paris. I mean, although you know, I think they were ambiguous about it because it was Edward, of course, had just launched, I think, hadn't he, his first appeal, um, because somebody had in Gascony had launched an appeal against his government directly to the King of France. So Edward was already sort of beginning to see some of the
Yeah.
downsides of the Treaty of Paris. So that these were sort of discontented, very, very powerful discontented figures, and they were conspiring. They were working together, and their main enemy was at this stage not Henry III so much, but the Earl of Gloucester.
Well,
Um,
would you say that Edward at this point is more or less alienated from his parents?
well,
Because I
yes,
believe
I
when
think
Henry
certainly his
left,
mother, anyway.
well, when
His
Henry left,
his mother.
he put
Mm.
wasn't it Robert Welleran in charge of Bristol Castle? I mean, he didn't even trust Edward to hold on to Bristol while he was away. So
Um, that's right, and of course, Edward had then in the Christmas of that year, 1259, he then I think
yeah,
ejected, hadn't he,
yeah.
Wallerand from control of Bristol Castle, and put in Roger de Leyburn, and Roger de Leyburn, of course, was a figure very much associated with the Lusignans, and the entourage of William of Valence, and therefore it is possible, well, that what was going on was a sort of plotting between Lord Edward and Simon de Montfort and the Lusignans together, at least in the eyes of their enemies, such as Queen Eleanor. And that they were attempting to advance that sort of cause while the king was abroad, and the
Like,
Earl of Gloucester were not friends, friendly either, was because um, the Earl of Gloucester had benefited directly from the exiling of the Lusignans, as you can see in Dorset, for example.
yeah, and also I think Leybourne was an enemy of the Clares. I believe that certain men of the Earl of Gloucester he caught doing something and he hanged them without just summarily like that when he was
Yes, that's right. There'd been something along those lines. I've gotten that point.
so
Yes,
yeah, so
yes,
you see this huge faction developing between
yes,
Gloucester's
yes,
men and
yes,
Edward's, and I think
yes,
Simon de Montfort sees a good opportunity to
yes. Yes,
take a
it's faction fighting, pure and simple.
Hmm.
Although it may have, I think that they all had this idea. I think possibly, for certainly from the Montfort point of view, it was convenient to say that if he could hold Parliament, then he could get his will, his case put across, because of course Montfort had. a lot of he was very persuasive sort of speaker. But I do think that you see other sort of discontented forces, don't you, possibly there underneath the surface. For example, there's that mysterious group of people called the Community of the Bachelors of England, who appealed to the Earl of Gloucester and the Lord Edward in October 1259, saying, that the barons had not, that the magnates had not fulfilled their promises to provide justice to their own tenants. So what was going on there? So there is a constituency there of some sort, that I think Edward and Montfort were hoping to somehow or other militarize and bring onto their cause.
What's happening now is that Henry sends an order that Parliament shall not meet till he returns, and the Home Council, led by the Bigot brothers and let's say the more conservative members, they are they are willing to agree. I mean, there's no rush in holding Parliament, and so this starts a conflict with Simon de Montfort and Edward, who come to London specifically to hold this Parliament, and we can sense now that there is a growing unease in London between these two factions, and it expresses itself in that very terrible way at the end of February, when a mob chases down three Italian clerks and murders them in broad daylight just outside of St. Paul's cemetery. And nobody saw anything, nobody heard anything, something like that. So you see this mob violence already beginning, but important is that the victims were foreigners. And I have to
Yes,
think that Simon de Montfort sees this as another opportunity, that if you use an anti-foreigner argument, you can really
yes.
work up the masses.
There was also an attack on Jews in London as well. The exchequer of the Jews was broken into, and some records were stolen. There's a sort of stray reference to that. So there's general sort of breakdown. But of course, the mayor, I think I'm right in saying that the Justicia was successful in preventing the retainers, as it were, of Montfort and Edward from entering into the city of London. I think they had to camp outside.
Clark,
Um,
I think Clerkenwell, wasn't it?
yes, yes,
Oh,
that's
well,
right.
I don't know if they closed the gates before because Richard of Cornwall arrived at some point, and
That's right. Well, he was then supposed to be, assisted in this kind of, um, as it were, keeping the peace. Although Henry himself sent an order saying that the officials of London, the Justicia, should admit the Earl of Gloucester.
yeah.
And in fact, Gloucester, of course, who's very, very much the favour of the month at the moment in terms of advising Henry, um, and he was sent across uh, on a royal. He was even given the royal barge to go across. And I'm not sure whether Gloucester was admitted into London, and I can't really remember now. But Henry was certainly would appear to be. Henry and the Queen seem to have been favouring the Earl of Gloucester's case.
Well, yeah, I mean, Gloucester had over 300 knights fees. I mean, he could summon a large force to counter whatever Edward and de Montfort were going to put together. But
Yes, he's the most powerful member of the aristocracy outside the royal family.
yeah,
Yes,
and I
yes,
guess it is from the Earl of Gloucester that Henry gets the idea that Edward is in fact in rebellion or insurrection against him or something to that effect. And I believe that Edward writes him a letter, something like that, or Henry is going to send somebody to check on Edward to find out, as he says, if words match deeds. Yeah.
yes.
And
If you notice that all the I think an awful lot of the emissaries sent by Henry are Savoyards or members of that sort of group at court, you know.
but
As well,
the,
that's another feature of that period.
but there's also a very interesting order or letter that Henry sends to his brother Richard of Cornwall, who was more or less kind of acting as regent by this point, that he should guard the coast against the Lusignans trying to get in with arms.
Yes.
Now, there could have only been one person who could have had some kind of contact with the Lusignans on the continent and organize, and that would have been Simon de Montfort. And it's
Yes.
just very interesting to think of Simon in the space of less than 2 years, sort of engineering the downfall of the Lusignans and now trying to bring them back just
They
for
were also
his.
they were also getting worried in the council that Aymer was going to get reinstated to Winchester with papal support as well. Aymer unfortunately missed the bus there, but you know there was that feeling that things could go that way, because of course he was a papally confirmed bishop elect, and so only the Pope could defrock him from Winchester, and they hadn't managed to achieve that.
I think there was a thing that the King, Wyke says the King was proposing to return to England and came to St. Omer. There it was suggested to him that the Lord Edward, with the advice of the barons and the nobles, had joined a conspiracy and begin to think about the deposition of his father and reigning himself. The King was to be taken prisoner and kept for the rest of his life. With his father out the way, Edward could place the crown on his own head. This suggestion was completely false, and nevertheless the king was afraid and delayed his return to England. And then Richard of Cornwall heard about it and sent a letter to Henry telling him that Edward and those barons, he might suggested that Henry could come to England boldly and confidently and fear nothing for himself. So it looks as though Richard of Cornwall had a role in this, and also that there'd been a rumour that Henry was going to be replaced by the Lord Edward. So that would have really sharpened the debate.
There is a chronicle that says something along those lines, isn't it, under 1260 or 1259-60?
And the Annals of Dunstable say the same sort of thing.
Yes.
Certain malicious people sowed seeds of cord between Henry and his son by asserting that the said Edward and his advisors were preparing to make war against the Lord King.
The threat seemed real enough to Henry and Eleanor that Edward was up to something. And so I think this is the reason why Henry delayed even longer and basically waiting for money to come from Louis so he could hire a
He
mercenary
seems
force.
to have made the right decision, Henry, by delaying. He sort of takes the sting out of it. And I think David Carpenter argued that it was quite a clever tactic, because by the time he did come, things had gone his way. And
yes, well, which that's begged the question, isn't it? You know, how much support did Montfort and Edward have? Was it a real rebellion? And that's very difficult to work out how much support they actually had. I mean, Edward was trying to raise money because this is where he obtained loans from Siena merchants via the Abbot of Peterborough, helped to broker that. And we know that because of some attempted reprisals against the Abbot of Peterborough. And I think Edward's finances were never completely sort of secure, and certainly they received a significant hit as a result of his activities in that period. So you know he's obviously trying to recruit mercenary knights and retainers, but it's difficult to know how widespread the support for that sort of access of Montfort and Edward would be. Clearly, it wasn't enough, was it? Otherwise, they would have got their way.
I
They
think
say the king got Clare on his side, and also John de Warenne, and that helped to push the weight towards the king as against these so-called rebels.
Well, yeah, but the fact is that Henry arrived at the head of basically a small army of knights.
100 knights, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yes.
and I always found it interesting how during Simon's deposition during that summer, he told that he said if the king came back with 4 knights, they would give them a welcome like no other. They summoned Edward to that sort of well, the actual parliament that Henry did convene in late April, and there Edward that which probably would have made some great theater. I mean, Henry loved theater, so in a way you can almost see that Edward is forced to stand before the magnates and
Mm.
declare just exactly what was going on while the king was away. And of course he makes that famous statement that none of you can judge me, only a king can judge me.
This problem of increasing violence between the grandees, though, that you can see that being perceived as a potential problem, even under the administrative clauses of the provisions of Westminster in October 1259, previous October, where it stated that people, the magnates, are not to bring horses and arms to Parliament unless they're specifically summoned to do that. So you get this sort of sense of the retinues somehow sort of flexing their muscles. It's almost a little bit of a sort of flavor of later medieval politics, isn't it? Perhaps when you think of retinues influencing Parliament.
I can't help but wonder if maybe a little bit of this was contrived by Henry, this sort of delay in France and all this tumult that's arising in London, is perhaps maybe he's trying to see, well, let's see how the council can run the kingdom without me. Let's see if peace and order can be maintained and so forth like that. Because we have that letter that Henry wrote where he said, maybe I think it was to the Earl of Gloucester, where he said that Louis kind of shamed him into returning home. He's like, why are you away for so long? You should go home and correct things in your kingdom. But of course, Henry was waiting for Louis to bring him money so he could go home and correct it with force. But also, I'm always a little bit shocked at Louis's hypocrisy, because he hid himself away in the Holy Land for 4 years after he bungled his crusade in Egypt. So he wasn't one to talk.
But didn't Henry issue that very famous manifesto where he said, "Look, I've been on the throne for all this length of time, and I've given peace and so on."
Oh no, that was 1261. That was
No, doesn't he issue that in
Yeah, that
King's
was August
make an appeal in
1261 when
1260 as well? I think.
the barons were
Oh,
put in
that's I'm mixing
anti-sheriffs.
them up. Yes, sorry. Yes, pardon me. Yeah, I've got that wrong.
So Henry comes home in I believe it's April 23rd thereabouts, with his force of 4 knights, and basically there's no resistance at all to him, and he convenes Parliament. Interesting, he had sent out the summons. He he put on the summons, these people need not apply. Like you don't need to show up, yeah. And so it was at this parliament where Edward was made to give an account of himself. And of course there was that famous statement that Henry said, "Don't let me see my son. If I do, I must shower him with kisses," and so forth. That really shows you what kind of father Henry was. And so a reconciliation of sorts was affected, probably by Richard of Cornwall. Yeah, the Queen, she was also reconciled to Edward. But of course, was this really was Edward really sincere? Oh, I think also he had to be reconciled with the Earl of Gloucester too. So there was like 3 people he needed have the kiss of peace with.
This is about the time Edward gets this nickname, the Leopard, isn't it? The Leopard. This is about this time where they're not quite sure which side he's playing.
Well, it is true that this reconciliation seems to be insincere, because we see him throughout the summer still adhering to Simon's party, or at least he's still giving his parents trouble, as in the case of Henry and Eleanor wanting to postulate John Mansell as the Bishop of Durham. And I believe Edward wrote a letter to the monks who were going to hold elections saying, "Hey, don't elect that scoundrel Manzo." He told them they should work to elect somebody who was very close to Simon de Montfort and his party. So I can imagine Eleanor must have been absolutely livid about that.
Well, also, if you look at Edward's charters, the Montfort continued to witness Edward's charters as well, well into the end of 1260. So, you know, he's very much, and at the Parliament of October 1260, Edward knights two of Montfort's sons as well. So, you know, he's very, very much still in with that group, and also in with the Lusignans as well, I would say.
Well, I mean, at this parliament, there was that so-called unholy alliance between Simon de Montfort, Edward, and Richard de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester.
Yes, yes.
Basically, Gloucester, who was never enthusiastic about the extent of reforms, more or less gets de Montfort and Edward to agree to sort of water down the pressures put on the magnates. And in return, Gloucester supports putting Simon de Montfort's men in the key positions of the ministries, because by this time, Simon de Montfort talks a lot about the provisions of Oxford. And what he's really after, I believe, is he's after Henry. He wants to control the crown, and he knows he can do it through the ministries, or whoever the officers of state are. So for him, reform is not so much about the little guy anymore, or protecting the peasants and these poor people, but controlling Henry. And just strangely enough, how he has Edward on his side. I can't really figure out what Edward's game is here, you know, that he's actively participating in promoting restrictions against the crown. It just
Obviously, if you look at Edward's what he then did at that point, of course, again, he appointed, for example, Guy de Lusignan as his lieutenant in Gascony, and clearly, again, Edward was appointing. He's clinging on to his own retainers and advancing their careers. So, once again, making a bid to get back control of his estates. So, in that sense, I think Edward obviously was making hay while they're again in that way, and of course, the new treasurer appointed in October 1260 was none other than the abbot of Peterborough, who had helped finance Edward's rebellion. So you can see Edward's sort of input in that sort of regime,
right.
and also Hugh Despenser had been he had featured in Edward's entourage, in a visit to Chester in the previous autumn. He's not only linked with Simon de Montfort. So it seems that the alliance had held firm. What is interesting, though, is why Gloucester caves in, and I think that Earl of Gloucester wasn't a very well man. It may be that you see with Gloucester all these twists and turns, this sort of sense of insecurity, because wasn't he? He'd been very severely taken ill in 1258.
Right, right.
And
The-
you wonder whether, this had really almost undermined his health, and he was constantly worried about his young son who might be succeeding him. I mean, Montfort and Gloucester are sort of two oldies, aren't they? They're sort of um,
Well,
worried about the
the Montfort's
future.
the oldest of the law. Well, Roger Bigott is
Yes,
too, but
yes.
he's more or less a non-entity by this point. So, but
Can we see
John,
this?
what do you think about the Savoyards and all this? I mean, we can see through Edward the ascendancy of the Lusignans again. I mean, the Savoyards must have looked upon all this with great apprehension. I mean, especially
Well, well,
Eleanor.
well, yeah, we see this as more of a rebellion or a cutting of the apron strings, a rebellion against his mother as much as anything else, not necessarily the crown, and of course taking advantage of Uncle Peter's absence from England at this point. It's an opportunity to put the elbows in each direction and create your own space. He's coming of age and he's wanting to assert his own authority, something, of course, he was very keen on as he got older.
And have you found anything about what Edmund was doing all this time? Because he doesn't really make much of an appearance in these.
No, he's that bit younger, isn't he? He doesn't appear at all until, in fact, sort of he's a sort of an onlooker during the Sicilian business, and when we
Well,
get to this time, he doesn't appear again until he's noted as being with his mother in Flanders. So yeah, it's a blank for this time.
yeah, I guess he would have been about 15 years old,
Yeah,
but
yeah. So he's
there,
still a boy.
yeah, and there was a very nice entry. I think it was 1259, maybe. So Edmund would have been about 14, where the council, because basically it's conciliar rule at this point, has agreed that to give Edmund money so that he might buy a horse. I thought
Hmm.
it's sort of
Yeah,
like letting a teenager buy his first car, you know.
he's still a pawn. He's still a pawn in the game at this point.
Yeah, yeah.
But Edward is that much older, and Edward is coming of age, and he's wanting to assert the authority. So yeah, I think it's against Eleanor. It's cutting the apron strings. Is my view of it.
Well, of course,
Yeah,
after this parliament, Edward takes off to the continent with the new knights. They're going to tourney. I believe all of his tournaments at this time were sort of ended disastrously. Like they lost all their armor and he got wounded and so forth. So I think Eleanor's worries about Edward must have drove her to the edge. And
No.
yes, I presume he also went to Gascony, didn't he? I think as well. It must have been this period as well. Paid a visit, I think. Yeah, it's an extraordinary period because um, uh, it's not. I don't know if you realise that Simon de Montfort didn't witness a single royal charter between March 1259 and October 1260. But from October 1260 until December 1260, he's constantly at court. And you can see a sort of real bid by Montfort then to become sort of active in English government.
Hmm.
I mean, he'd been abroad for much of the period before then. And so you can see the sort of it's very much a sort of regime driven by Montfort in this period, which of course I suppose is all the more reason why Henry wanted to overthrow it in in uh, in the spring of 1261.
Well, he gets that visit. This Montfortian ascendancy. Montfort then leaves. At the point Peter of Savoy returns, of course, Hugh, and of course that Christmas with Richard and with Peter whispering in Henry's ear is where the thing starts to then go again the other way.
Yes,
And
yes,
so yeah, you very great fluctuations in this period.
I think that the 1260 from the beginning of the what should have been the Canomas Parliament to the Christmas of 1260, I think it sort of like a showpiece of what the provisions of Oxford can do as far as government is concerned. And then you have all this strife that's just going on between the different factions, between
Mm.
the king and the council, the king and individual barons. And I think for Henry, it just was clear that it's just not working anymore. I mean, they
No,
had the provisions of Westminster. They brought a lot of good reforms to effect, especially reforms that concern the wider realm, not just the central government. And I think for Henry, he's like, okay, we've done our thing, and now I want to get back to the business of Sicily, back to the business of my crusade, and so forth. But he's just got this disgruntled baron named Simon de Montfort with who's
yeah,
getting a bit too
it's also
much
quite
help
a
from his son.
Yeah, it was also quite a vindictive regime, wasn't it? Because isn't it in the winter of 1260 that Hewlett Despencer's
Mm.
heir goes to
Yep.
Sussex and deliberately would appear to be targets
Yeah.
Peter of Savoy's
Yep.
estates there and estates administration. And again, that's a sort of a sort of I think a case of revenge, isn't it?
Yep. Yep.
I
Yeah,
suppose.
exactly. And here Henry gives robes to Hugh Despencer. Like, are you on my team now? And Hugh just basically says, no, I'm going after these people. And so he made it clear where he stood in this upcoming split.
It does seem that the direction of the government at this point does tend to be whether Simon de Montfort is absent from the kingdom or Peter of Savoy is absent from the kingdom, and they don't ever seem to. Hugh is right; they don't ever overlap, do they? They're never in the kingdom together
No,
at
they
the
don't.
same
No,
time.
no. You can literally see to the
Yeah.
day. You're quite right. You can see to the day. Montfort witnesses until some point in December, and then no, and after that, then Peter of Savoy turns up at court, and they're not there together. No, no, absolutely, yes, yes.
So
It's
that's
it's
probably why
it,
we've got this government veering in different directions at once, almost.
it's
Yes,
interesting
yes,
that when you see this kind of this sort of character-driven strife that I, Simon de Montfort must have been a very vindictive individual. That if you crossed paths with him, he was going to come after you, because we saw how close he and Peter of Savoy worked
Yeah.
before and just shortly
yes,
after
yes,
1258, and now he's just out to subvert Peter and
yes.
everything.
Well,
Mm.
this is also this. I forget, isn't it a royal letter that says that something along the lines of that when the king, or at least it was thought that the king was going to revive his trial against Simon de Montfort, that Montfort says, you won't do this, otherwise I'm going to really do something rather nasty to the royal proctors involved in this. And again, it's a typical sort of piece of the way in which Montfort is the sort of really a hard man.
But that,
Um,
a
and
very hard man, but also a man very assured of himself in that he takes advantage of his pedigree, because he always has France. I mean, that could be a nice song, really. Where Gloucester and all of them, all the ties to the continent have been cut. Simon just easily takes a boat over, and it's not just any kind of friendship with Louis and the royal family, but he's got these near relatives in the south of France, his cousin in the Holy Land. The Montforts are still a very powerful family in Europe, and Simon
yeah,
knows that,
yeah.
that he always has that backing.
They were also appealing, of course, to the arbitration of the Queen of France, weren't they?
Mm. And
By the
that's
spring
that's
of
a yeah,
1261.
that's a very
And
good point, Hugh.
again,
Yeah.
that's very interesting. That sort of protracted arbitration.
Well,
This thing
yeah,
with the French court is Simon thinks he has the backing of the French court, but of course
He might, yes,
Eleanor is working with Marguerite. They're sisters, and of course
yes.
Marguerite is then influencing Louis. So yeah, who has the ear of the King of France? Who has the ear of the French monarchy at this point?
Yes.
Interesting, and I think
Yeah,
that the two sisters are the ones.
Yes, and I could actually see also that the Savoyards trying somehow to sweet talk Montfort round, as well. And and again, it was a smart move, and I think in many ways, I think Montfort doesn't um, press home any advantage that he could have had in the course of 1261 when the king rebelled. King tried to move against the provisions of Oxford, of course, and got released from his oath in 1261. Montfort never really pulls all the stops out in opposition. And that's because of the continuing the opportunity of mediation in the French court, and I think it's very, very, very clever sort of move. I think from the
Well,
Savoy.
I'm more of the opinion that Simon de Montfort was simply outwitted by Henry and Eleanor. I think he was really pushing for rebellion in 1261 with the anti-sheriffs, with the anti-parliament, and so forth. But Eleanor and Henry, they got to Gloucester and all the other major barons. Even Peter de Montfort went over to the royal side. And I mean, that's just the fact that Simon got outwitted, and that just further embittered him, which is why he took off. He says, I'm not going to be amongst these perjurers, as he calls them.
But Montfort was still, he was still receiving royal pensions in 1261, don't you, on a
Yeah,
regular
yeah. I
basis.
mean, yeah, yeah, you're right. They always tried to placate him. They always tried to honor he, I, I always think that what Simon is really after is a kind of legacy. He grew up with one of the greatest legends of the 13th century, his father. I mean, nobody could match his father in terms of commitment, determination, crusade valor, victory on the battlefield. I mean, his
Now,
father was a huge legend, and I think Simon is trying to live up to that somehow.
can I throw out a question for everybody? Why didn't the relationship, why didn't the axis of Simon de Montfort and the Lord Edward, and the Lusignans for that matter, continue much after um, the end of 1260?
Well, my own feeling is that Edward had bottomed out. He had borrowed all the money he could. He had borrowed so much money that he had to. The only person who would give him a loan was King Louis of France, and he had just kind of made a mess of everything. And he knew when he came back in the spring of 1261 that he basically had to submit to his parents. It was it.
I think I'd agree with you there, Darren. It had gone as far as it was going to go.
Yeah.
Um,
Because Edward is completely submissive after that. I mean, he's absolutely on Henry and Eleanor's side 100%.
Could it be also that I think Montfort, as one of these people, didn't work very well with other people? There's a sort of litany, isn't there, of Montfort quarreling with his allies. And I mean, obviously one thinks of young Gilbert de Clare, the new Earl of Gloucester, which was pretty fatal in 1265, and you get a sort of, I think anyway, you get a flavor of this and in the breakdown in relations between Edward and Simon de Montfort. And I still think one of the big things that is really mysterious is why, since Montfort's sons were Edward's cousins, why there is no evidence of Edward ever promoting them in his household. There's no equivalent to Henry of Almaine, and the friendship of Edward
But then
and the Montfort family. It's really weird, given the fact that they were relations. It's odd.
But then Hugh, on the other side, Montfort was very much pulled towards this sort of religious center, that he was heavily under the influence of Adam Marsh, Robert Grosseteste. I mean, he had his children raised in those households. And I have to wonder if he's becoming so introspective about his own weaknesses and failures. I mean, certainly the regime he adopted after the provisions of Oxford were enacted was one of a very self-flagellation, waking up at midnight and praying all night and wearing a hair shirt
Well,
and no relations with Eleanor and I mean, God, can you imagine Henry doing anything like that? So I think Simon has just more or less becoming this very hardened type of himself, basically with very strong religious overtones. I mean, we know Henry was very pious as well, but that was a sort of showy piety,
well,
mass.
Montfort was getting on, wasn't he? So I think
Yeah,
he's
he's like
worried about his
Simon de
son.
Montfort is a latter day John Calvin. He's got the
That's a good
sword,
one.
he's got the
Yes.
Yeah.
purity of faith, and he's just going to run that sword across the land. I
Yes.
mean, he is essentially a born crusader, which he got from his family. So
Yeah. What do you think the sort of, if you like, the rest, if you like, of English society made of all this in 1259 to
Mm.
60? Um, what do you think it did to the reputation of the provisions of Oxford regime?
I personally think they probably weren't even, well, let's say, they were well known in the sense of the querele, that the idea that they could have justice. Yeah. But that sort of flamed out very early on. And I think that was probably a great disappointment to the mass of people. They would have known about them, sure enough, and they're like, hey, you know, where's the king's court? Where's my justice? We're waiting and waiting, and there's just all this factional infighting going on. So I think that most people would have seen the provisions of Oxford as getting their justice more than, of course, the provisions of Westminster. And of course, this is because Simon de Montfort very effectively used it as propaganda. I mean,
Mm.
we had that famous letter of John Manzo where he talks about seeing all these preachers at work, these Franciscans going through the countryside and telling the people about the provisions of Oxford and how you're going to have your justice, so forth. So that was
Well, that's
Montfort's
interesting.
greatest
Yes.
advantage.
Yeah, no doubt. Probably at that point, they start to confuse the provisions of
Yeah, yeah.
Oxford with the provisions of Westminster, don't they?
Mm.
And that's very convenient. But you see, the point is, there's a bit of a difference, isn't there, between reform and the political structure,
Right.
which
Good.
creates a magnet council. And I just wonder whether the reputation, if you like, of a magnet council was damaged quite considerably, if not fatally, by what happened in 1259 to 60, because it doesn't result in stable government. It results
Mm.
in anything but stability. And the result is, of course, all the more reason for return to royal rule in 1261. I mean, that royal rule failed only because Henry III botched it up. Um, and
Sorry. What did he botch up exactly?
what? Well, he lost the Battle of Lewes. Oh boy.
Okay, well, okay. First of all right, let's make it clear. Edward lost that, not Henry. But you're right in the sense that I have to wonder if Henry and his advisors in France are concocting this delay to put a test to the home council. Can the realm be ruled by council alone without the king there, or is it going to fall apart? And I
The
think
council certainly didn't cover itself in glory, did it?
I think you make a good point, really. I think that the ordinary person in the street wouldn't have been too interested in the way the government was constructed, but what the results were, wouldn't they?
Mm. Mm.
well,
Yeah.
and this is why the Statute of Marlborough was enacted with 2 years after the fighting or the Battle of Evesham, because this essentially put the good reforms, the reforms that affected the wider realm, into legal codification. The provisions of Oxford were only a constitution of government, no more. It didn't really affect the wider people, whereas the provisions of Westminster, this was more or less the good reforms, and they always had Henry's support. Simon could have easily sold that to the people, but he was after power.
Yeah, to my mind, I mean, it is very difficult to gauge this in numbers, but I think the core of the real Montfortian supporters they were a minority even in 1261, and I mean, after all, Henry was able to overthrow the provisions of Oxford without any real fighting, and I think, as you say, the bulk of the baronage, if you like, voted with their feet. However much Henry might have been felt to be wanting in various times, it was better than being, the sort of instability, I think.
He was still a king.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Well, great.
Yeah. So I was just going to say he was still the king, and the king meant stability in the end.
Yeah,
Well, you knew where you were.
and I think when people look back, I mean, what the 1258 basically came through a variety of just factors of bad luck. All these things congregated at one point, but when you look at the personal rule 25 years before that, I think most people, they had peace, they had prosperity, they had the church. They weren't being dragged off to foreign wars and taxed to pay for them and all that. So I think probably most people would have. The Jews, of course, were a different story. But anyway, we should end it right there.
Yeah.
And
well, thank you very much, Darren.
Yeah, I just
thank you.
want to say that in 2 weeks I will be at Evesham. And I'm going to talk at the Battle of Evesham Festival.
Will you survive? Will there be a death squad looking for you?
Yes, there'll be.
All right, gentlemen, have a very great rest of the summer.
Nice
So see you again next time. Yeah, enjoy
Evesham.
All right, good day.
Thank you very much, everybody. All the best now.
Thank you. Bye, Hugh.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.